And to start with, really, I want to have a look at what type of audience, or how do we define our audiences? Because as Darko said, obviously MOOCs have the possibility to reach everyone with an internet connection, basically. But as we've seen with the webinars in this conference, the debate has shifted a little bit from looking at a truly including everyone within a MOOC to more specific aims and more specific goals within our MOOC design. And I was wondering, from your experience with creating MOOCs, whether people can type in the chat whether they look at these kinds of differentiations between, for example, which age groups or which professions or which nationality. Is this something you consider when creating a MOOC in your institutions? Just to give me some basis as well in terms of where you are in terms of this topic. It's going to give you some time to type as well. So Darko mentions MOOCs for refugees and migrants. Are they from, would you specify which areas or which countries the migrants come from, or where, you know, where they go as well? So is it the Netherlands as a context specifically? Okay, so 8 specific countries. That's very interesting. There's some more people typing as well. So refugees arriving in those 8 countries. Okay, so it's specified based on the country they're going to. Jonathan, I'm familiar with the creation process, having worked at the Open University Business School. We are only just stepping up the creation. And then Mosen. Okay. So I think I'm just, there's one person still typing, so I'm just going to wait for that person to post their comment. So we've got a post from Latvia. They don't provide MOOCs at the moment, but are looking into this. That's very interesting. And then Mosen has done his doctoral thesis on MOOCs and design from a connectivist approach. And in Cyprus, they do consider demographics of potential students. Brilliant. So I think there's a mixed audience in terms of where you are, in terms of how many MOOCs you've already designed and kind of considering these elements. Entry. Yes, so in terms of targeting a broad audience, that's definitely a challenge, and that's what we'll be discussing today. Especially, we'll focus in on nationality in this case, but I do think one of the things to consider is it's not just nationality, it is different age groups, it is different professions as well. Of course, we have this opportunity to look at a global audience, and like I said, anyone with an internet connection can access a MOOC, but just because they can access it doesn't mean that it's something that is useful to them, and that's where design thinking comes in. So one of the main takeaways I hope you have from this is know your audience, or know your learner. And we'll have a look at some examples of this, and we'll have a look at how we can then, once you know your learner, how can you then put interventions in place to make this more specific, make the material more specifically interesting for them. So I'm going to go to the next slide, which is around engagement. And again, this is a question. Engagement in different institutions is measured in different ways. You can measure engagement in terms of, so here in the UK we have the National Student Survey, and that's very much around student satisfaction. How happy are students after they've completed their course, and how satisfied are they with the course experience as such. You can look at it more from a pedagogic point of view, so you can say, no, engagement is about have they reached their learning outcomes, have they learned what I intended them to learn from the design. It can be about what impact does this course have, so how many people have enrolled, how many people have logged in, how many badges and awards have been earned, the duration of the course. So there are all these kinds of there's all this kind of data that we're tracking, and that could potentially tell us something about engagement. But it is a question in terms of how do you, within your institution, see engagement? What is the, how do you track it, and how do you label that? I am going to continue to the next slide, but if anyone wants to share their perspective on that, I can pick that up in the next part as well. So within the University of Derby, we have started creating MOOCs in 2015 as part of the remit of what was then called the Innovation Hub. And within the Innovation Hub, we did research around the MOOC design as such. We started with 2 MOOCs, and at the moment we have 4 MOOCs online. And those MOOCs are around topics such as depression, dementia. We also have a MOOC on operational management, which is tutor-led. So we have a variety, and one on autism as well. So they are most of our MOOCs have a social element to them. And as you can imagine, the topics that we look at are quite specifically defined from a cultural context. If you look at how we deal with depression in the West, and how we talk about depression, that is completely different from how someone from Japan, for example, would express their opinions and thoughts on depression. So these are reasons why we've started looking into different national audiences and how we want to create content for them. We didn't start from scratch. We have an online part of the university called UDOL, the University of Derby Online, and there we already have a module that model that we use for the module development for our business as usual, so our postgrad and graduate courses. And basically this model is very much the minimum that we would expect. So we would expect certain information to be there, and we would expect certain supports to be there. So every unit would have aims and objectives. Every unit would be interactive and therefore more engaging in different media types. Every unit will have an activity-led approach. And that means that it's not a handbook online, but it's really about the learner doing things rather than reading things. And these kinds of principles that we use in our regular content is we also use within our MOOCs. So that's kind of the baseline that we have. So in the summary or the abstract for this talk, I put this this quote: "Empirical evidence suggests that MOOC learners are demotivated due to a lack of instructor feedback, no teamwork or group interaction, and poor communication." And I think what is interesting here is if we look at these three concepts from a cultural perspective, the expectation on all three of these or these areas will be different. The way an instructor is viewed in different countries differs. How people work as a group, and actually whether, and that I found quite an interesting finding, because there are situations where group work is also not something that people will easily pick up, because it's more about the individual rather than the team. And in other national contexts, that is very heavily present. And poor communication, and obviously poor communication can be read, that feedback can be read in different ways. How we address students. So one of the advices we give our tutors here at UDOL around interacting and engaging with students is really use your voice. So don't make it a very clean instruction that is void of personality in a way, which we tend to do when we write instead of talk. But make it something personable, and where that is something that is accepted in kind of the UK context, and I think in the Western context in general, there are cultures where that would the expectation of that would be slightly different, and that is where we get into this field of tension in terms of, can we, from a design perspective, design for everyone? And I can give you a quick answer in the sense, yes, if you have a lot of time and unlimited resources, you could aim for that. But I don't think it's necessarily what we're looking for. I think what the suggestion in the article was that instructional design or learning design could provide a solution to some of these issues. And I think when we look at learning design, and you have it in other design practices as well, actually what you do is you, instead of designing for everyone, you would have a specific persona or a couple of personas in mind, and you would know those learners or those personas. So there is the question in terms of, are we trying to reach the whole world? Well, maybe, but specific parts, I would say. And when you know that, and when you have identified that, that's when you can really dive deeper into, okay, so how are we now going to look at all those different levers that we can work with? So the first thing we've done, and this was when we started creating MOOCs in 2015, one of the main principles we used at that point in time was modular design. So the idea was that every week was one unit, and that one unit would have a topic, and each unit would have a specific aim or specific destination, if you think about it in a learning journey type of way. The first MOOCs we did were tutor-led, so they would there would be a tutor having a look at the discussion board forum, and they would get information from the students on the discussion boards as well, because they could see the discussions taking place. I think that's actually one of the more important lessons learned from us. That when you start designing something, you do design for a wider audience, but then when you see people interacting with your course, you can actually use that data, and you can use their responses to then update and refresh the course as well, to really interact with the students, maybe put some small interventions in place on the spot by answering them or by adding an activity, but also by looking at, okay, so which audiences do we get? When you put something out there on the World Wide Web, it's interesting to see which audiences actually gravitate towards your course as well, and based on that, if you have a course that turns out to be very popular for an Asian audience, for example, then that is something you can add another layer to your design almost, where you say, okay, so we've designed this course in this way, but we've noticed our Asian students respond differently to certain activities, so let's look at an interactivity specifically for them, because there are so many of them on the course. So that's in terms of modular design. Every aim for a student is specific for that week, which means that students can choose to only do one module and not do the full course. It can be that they choose that because what they're looking for in the course and the reason they signed up is treated in one unit only. And I think the main thing when looking at those types of decisions that a student makes is being very overt and communicating very clearly what the aim of each unit is, so they can actually overtly make that choice as well. Because MOOC learners are often learners that have something specific in mind that they're trying to get out of it, and then there are the more kind of lifelong learners as well, who may be interested in the wider topic, who will go through all the different modules. So modular design helps in generating that choice for students to interact with parts of the content that they're interested in specifically. And then there's the levels of engagement. So once you know a little bit about your audience, you know a bit about their age group, you know a little bit about their cultural context, you can have a look at, okay, you know, is this topic something where we want people to engage with at a very high level based on Bloom's taxonomy, for example, or is this a topic where we just want them to do a knowledge quiz at the end so that they remember something? Culturally, there is usually a preference. There are countries where, especially when you get to the higher levels of Bloom, they are not necessarily trained, or the wider audience, I should put it that way, the wider audience within those countries isn't necessarily trained to apply critical thinking, for example. And there's a question there in terms of activity design as well. So maybe have quizzes for people that want to engage on that level, but also provide a stretch activity for people that really do want to engage on a higher level as well, maybe on the level of analysis or the level of evaluation. The next thing to consider is what type of language you use, and I've already touched upon this a little bit. And there's a choice here in terms of whether you write towards whether you so if it's, for example, critical thinking you're trying to teach, and you're setting the example of your institution maybe you know, being really allowing for the metacognition level and really trying to get them further. If I give an example from our MOOCs, you know, a topic like autism is treated differently in different cultural contexts. The way you would interact with someone with autism, the way society responds to people with autism, the way the media and politics portray people with autism, all of these things can differ. And then there's the question, can we know when we as the University of Derby create this course, how people in other countries respond to this? Our initial answer was no. We look at it from our perspective, and this is the perspective we know best. This is the perspective we've done research on, and well, we know how we know how we view this. So it's then the question, instead of saying we're creating this course for different target audiences and really customizing it to them, it's saying we're not customizing our view, but we're customizing the scaffolding of the learning towards why we view it this way. So for the autism course, that meant having a look at the activity design, looking at, on the one hand, knowledge quizzes. What does research show autism really is? So making it less of an opinion and more of a research underpinned topic. And on the other hand, having activities in there that actually discuss this as well. So that way you get information from the different audiences that you have on your course, and you can actually interact with them, and they can interact with one another as well and share experiences and share different points of view. The next step up is then, instead of just sharing, to really look at, okay, so why do we think about it this way, and why do other people think about it in another way? And that's where kind of that metacognition level and that evaluation level starts being activated. I think that's an element where if you put enough interventions in place, and if you look carefully at the discussion board activity, that's when you can really start using the data on there and the responses on there to really focus on your different national audiences. And you know, just as a tip, have a look at what kinds of words they use as well, because they will use specific terminology and they will use specific moral and emotional, in some cases, terms on the discussion boards, with which you can make out what types of opinions and what types of ideas are out there. The next thing, and this was an easier one in a way, because this is something you can do before a course starts, is looking at the case studies. If you are looking at a specific country, or if you are looking at engaging with a wider audience, have a look at your case studies. Within our depression course, we have a few narratives from people who have suffered depression, who have suffered from depression, or who have had family members, and they share their experiences. And one of the easier ways to connect with your learner is to just check whether you can find these case studies for from other perspectives as well. So from other countries, what would a family member, how would they describe this? And what I like about sharing those case studies is it's not just the international learner then having that recognition that a Western learner has with a Western story, but it's everybody within the group learning from one another as well, that there are different views and that you do look at things in a different way sometimes. And those can be, so in terms of, the way we deal with depression is one way, but there are actually interesting practices elsewhere as well. So being open and not labeling one view better than another view as well. The third thing I wanted to touch upon is the feedback. And feedback is a tricky topic in MOOCs, in the sense that the audiences prefer manual tutor feedback because it's personalized. They will achieve more from that, is their perception. But I think there's a lot we can do with automated and peer feedback on the one hand. So we use peer feedback in our discussion board forums in the sense of students interacting with one another and thereby correcting each other or showing a different view. But you can do it a lot more structured as well, so you could group students together and give them a peer feedback model. It's tricky in the sense of large audiences and not everybody engaging, but you can check which students would like to interact in that stream. So you could, at the beginning of the course, have a diagnostic where you ask them, would you like to do group activity? And then allow for them to do that in that setting with people who have all opted in for that. And the other element is automated feedback. As said before, I think automated feedback improves while the course continues. So it's having review cycles of your MOOCs and really determining, okay, so within the discussion boards or within the data we've gathered around this course and with the interactions we've seen, with the responses we've had from students, these are the things that we want to put into our new iteration to make sure that there are more interventions in place. I think it's more a building type of activity, so it doesn't mean a review doesn't have to mean you take anything out. It can mean you make it more specific, or you put an intervention in place for a specific audience. And I think that's where the opportunities to really interact with your audience appear, and really link to that national context as well, if that is something you're looking to do. The other elements are adding activities in as part of the feedback, and I think this is a really important one, especially when we're talking about, we mentioned critical thinking. So if that is something we want to add, if that is really one of the learning objectives, if that's one of the aims of the course. And we notice that some students or learners are able to do that, but other learners aren't. A remedial activity in place and really giving them an intervention there to develop that further. Maybe explain as well. I think that's something, and maybe having a video of the tutor explaining to international students who struggle with this what the perspective is within your institution on critical thinking and why it's so important. That can be, you know, something specific to put in place to really make them aware of what it is that the course is aiming to do. Stretch activities are you know, the other side of the coin in terms of some students actually do want to go further, and it's maybe suggesting projects that they can do within their own context. You know, is there something, a project they can take away from this course? You know, we're looking at the depression course, for example. One of the activities I've been thinking about is this something that people in their own context want to engage with more? And is there some way we can recommend a project that they can put in place in their own context? I think as we've gone through the different slides, it's become very apparent that something that is really important is what I've said at the beginning, so knowing your learner, but on the other hand also gathering data to know your learner better. And I've spoken about activity a lot, and I've spoken about intervention a lot, and I think the reason why I emphasize it is, on the one hand, it's about the students doing things, so it's their progress that we can have a look at when they engage in activity. But it's also us getting to know our learners better, because when we look at, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on around big data. I prefer to call it smart data in the sense that when I look at an activity, I also look at how I get information from how the student has interacted with that. So when we look at engagement within the University of Derby, one of the things we do really want to look at is, okay, we want to know whether people like the course, whether people engaged with it, whether they logged in, whether they had a lot of entries, whether their discussion board posts were very long, for example. But we also want to know whether the learning objectives we set out for them are things they are actually engaging with during the course and maybe even after the course. So we have surveys in place, but we are also looking at our activity design and looking at our at how each activity gives us some information about the engagement levels. And like I said before, it's that information that you can then use to link that back to national contexts and you know, specific worldwide audiences as well. So that is kind of that continuous improvement cycle that we go through. And I think the main focus at the moment for us is really improving the MOOCs we have currently running. So this is definitely an element that we will be looking into in terms of international audiences as well. I see there has been some engagement on the chat as well, so I was just going to pick those up. So there's Antri said, we also face challenging in engaging learners in distance education courses here at OUC. So when you, so with engagement, how have you measured that engagement? What kind of engagement is missing, or what kind of data are you finding that makes you say that is a challenge for you guys? I am going to check the other posts as well, but that gives you some time to maybe give some more information on that entry. Gathering data to know your learner better is often a big surprise and unexpected. I agree. So you adjust what you are doing accordingly. Yes, exactly. So it is surprising what you find sometimes, and I find that actually very rewarding in the design process, to see that actually you can make a lot of design assumptions, and it is something we tend to do. You know, and I listened to myself during the presentation, and there are, you know, Japanese people would prefer a more formal voice, for example, in their courses. Well, that's an assumption. We don't know that necessarily. Maybe they chose to do our course at the University of Derby instead of something in Japan because they wanted Western approach. So I think it's important to check those assumptions. So thank you, Jonathan. And then, sorry, Andrea has had already answered. So from your experience or from Smart Data, are there any certain types of activities that students do not engage with, or where they engage the least? There's an element of, if there is a little amount of risk, social risk, people tend to engage a lot quicker. So, for example, quiz questions are usually something people do quite quickly because there are no other students that can see it. Discussion board forums are more risky in that sense, socially risky. So some students will answer more there, but you do have, you know, the lurker. You do have people that only engage in discussion board forums by reading other people's posts, and there's a question there whether they should or you know, do you make them, which is, it's a decision to make from a design perspective. Can they see other people's posts before they post their own? Is a design decision you can make. Personal preference, I think you have introverts and extroverts in a classroom as well. So I don't see that as necessarily a bad thing, but it is that question you don't get. That means you don't get all the data from everyone. Yeah, I'm just trying to think what are other, I think group work, I thought that was actually really interesting when I started looking at the literature review around this. That group work is something people ask for, because it's my experience that group work is something that students are actually quite scared to engage with. So those would be things that, although they would learn the most from those activities, they are the activities where they need a bit of a nudge to engage with it. I think what I'm also not saying is that therefore we shouldn't do discussion board forums or we shouldn't do group activities, because as we've seen, they are actually asking for it as well. So I don't think them not engaging says something about not needing to do it. I think it says something about, hang on. I think it says something about how we instruct them and how we help them overcome that social risk element. So it's about maybe the tutor giving an example so that they can see how it's done, or maybe having someone do a bit of a tutorial video on this so that they feel more comfortable in this. Darko is asking, do you have tools, mechanisms analyzing during the MOOCs related to kind and quality of contributions? Yeah, so at the moment we use D2L, Desire to Learn, or Brightspace as a platform. And Brightspace has its own tools, integrated tools to check engagement. And we don't check it live. So what we do is we gather that data at a certain point, and then we have a look at it. But yes, then it is about both the quality and the kind of contributions. The first reiteration of our MOOCs was actually a transfer from the Canvas system to the D2L system. And we've decided to have a look at the difference between tutor-led MOOCs as opposed to learner-led MOOCs, and looking at whether we can use the data, the social data from our tutor-led MOOCs to inform a more automated MOOC approach, and that's the first iteration that we're in at the moment. And then Antri says, participating in synchronous, asynchronous discussions mostly. We can see from various learning analytic tools that most of them are indeed online and going through materials, content, activities, etc. But there is little participation in web conferences, web meetings. That's interesting. And you're trying to, I agree, some of our students stated that they don't prefer group work because they have different schedules. They feel that they will not be able to have to communicate online with people from other cities, countries, etc. Yes, and I think, I mean, the time zone element is definitely an issue there as well. So if you do have a wider audience spanning across time zones, that can be an issue, especially with the synchronous sessions. It's agreed within our normal remit, so in our graduate, postgraduate courses, we actually, most of our tutors will agree a time with the group, so they won't necessarily meet in our office hours even. They will choose a time. 7 o'clock in the evening, for example, is quite popular because at least if you are spanning the world, that seems to be a good time for most people. But that is definitely an issue. And it is also, I guess, informing or being clear on what they will get out of the communication with other people. So maybe it's being overt in that the aim of the course is to get that international perspective as well. And if that is something that is the aim, then you can really hone in on that and focus in on that. Jonathan is saying, getting the mix of student cohort right is surely largely down to chance. Occasionally the rapport between students is so good that they become online friends even. I agree. And it is, and that's the element in terms of when we, I would challenge the idea that we can steer this. I think marketing does a really good job in within the university here, targeting certain target audiences. So the likelihood of certain groups being on our courses or being on our MOOCs is better. But I do agree that in terms of the mix of students is not just age, nationality, profession, it is also personal. And offering the chance to create that personal connection is something to consider, because in the example you mentioned, you know, to become friends, that does require the space to do that. So it does require discussion board forums, for example. So when we moved from our tutor-led courses to our learner-led courses, that was an element that we decided to not lose. I think it's more put on hold or reconsider, but to have a look at, okay, how can we look at distance learning and personalized learning and individual learning, for example. So those are our design decisions. Are there any more questions from the group? Because I do see it's 5:02, so we've got 5 minutes left. Are all mentioned feedback possibilities suitable for massive audiences? So if I go back to the feedback slide, I've grayed out manual and tutor because I don't think those would be suitable. I think we have tried this in our previous iteration when we did tutor-led MOOCs, and the way we did it then was by having a weekly session where the tutor was videoed, and that session would be a live conversation between the tutor and a colleague, and questions that had come up during the discussion boards would be summarized and fed back onto the student via that mechanism. In terms of peer feedback, again, it depends. So peer feedback works for students that actually want to engage in group activities, so I would pre-select, or I would, in those cases, diagnose in terms of who wants to do peer feedback and who doesn't. But when you do, then you can engage with that. Automated feedback is obviously the sort of main go-to. I think the ones in red are the ones where I think we need to do more, and within the wider sector, I think using activities to feedback. So if someone has done a quiz, and so that's the automated part, but then allowing a new activity because we know that one of the answers was incorrect, and therefore we put a remedial activity, a little project that a student can interact with in place, or to make them aware of the fact that they've not quite reached that yet. I think that's very valuable, and that's when you really start focusing on learning objectives and learning outcomes. And the same thing with stretch activities. I do think, you know, sometimes an activity, a stretch activity, or something fun for the learner who has achieved. Maybe some additional piece of video is released from the tutor when a student has interacted with a discussion board, for example. So that kind of gives them feedback, but it also gives them an incentive to engage with the discussion boards. And then Jonathan is saying, a few years ago, Coursera introduced mentors who were always people who had completed the course. They would mentor on with over an 82% grade. FutureLearn followed suit, kind of with a formal subject matter mentor. This means that students do get responses in threaded discussion and someone to nudge it along. Yes, I agree. And those are things, there are very nice examples of others who have used either peer learning or tutor support. I think Coursera's peer feedback is actually quite interesting to have a look at as well in terms of their model. I think when I looked the last time, I'm not sure if this is still true, but when I looked the last time, what they did was they would allow, you would only get your feedback if you'd responded, I think, to 2 or 3 other people. So that way you can kind of, you can help that along. I think there are some technical issues when you look at peer feedback in that way, because you do need a platform that allows for that type of interaction. And adding to that, companies, organizations also do that by encouraging or rewarding, for example, active forum members. I agree, yeah. Yeah, and that's the advantage actually that FutureLearn and Coursera have. So if you're looking at it from a platform point of view, that is definitely, and edX, for example, does this as well. They own their own platform, so, or they further develop their own platform, and I think there are a lot of higher education institutions that are not in that situation. I think there are advantages and disadvantages to it, in the sense of, on the one hand, Coursera and FutureLearn can really align their development strategy with their learning design strategy. On the other hand, if a platform really only has one learning design type, because most platforms are created a little wider than that. If it's really only one learning design perspective, then that's limiting as well. So, for example, if you take FutureLearn, they are very much a social constructivist type of platform. But that means that automated feedback opportunities and things like that are less developed. And yes, they do. So, and that's actually, so the social media buttons and things like that really link to that as well. So there are platforms that really sort of dictate the learning theory behind what they're doing. There are also platforms, for example, that are very much designed for micro-learning type of interaction, and those use a lot more, so they underpin their platform with research from more behaviorist backgrounds, for example. So I think each platform has their own advantages and disadvantages, but that is definitely something to consider when looking at these, and when you do your design, make sure that the system is in place for the type of design you're looking for, or the other way around. Get a system that really backs up the learning theory that you want to underpin what you're doing. I would say that is something to look at. MOOCs have the great opportunity to have those big conversations with people, but I would have a look at, for example, discussions in FutureLearn that are running alongside the pages, and, for example, look at the data there in terms of how far back do those, so if someone responds on those, do they respond to the comment below it or on the same page, or do people actually scroll down and engage with a wider discussion as well? And I think there's actually some more research to be done in that area. Hi, Darko.
So hi, I'm just popping up because it's more than 1
Sure.
hour that we had the webinar. I think that we have a very engaging chat and discussion with people attending. Just to know that the webinar is recorded. It will be made available very soon together with the slides of Marlies. And that there will be 2 other webinars tomorrow. One by the Open University UK addressing inclusion and accessibility issues, and one by John Texler from Wolverhampton on the community kind of MOOCs. So please register or use the same URL as you did for this meeting. Thank you again, Marlies. Very nice presentation and very good to have this kind of elaboration. And thank to all the people attending to this meeting. See you next time.
Thank you everyone for your questions as well and for your engagement. It was a great